Ever since this war started, there's been a lot of concern about Russia's nuclear arsenal and a lot of discussion about Ukraine's lack thereof. Why doesn't Ukraine have nuclear weapons? Well, it used to. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, it left nuclear arms scattered across former Soviet states, and Ukraine was one of them. Suddenly, it became the third largest nuclear power in the world, behind the United States and Russia. Ukraine inherited nearly 5,000 nuclear weapons from Moscow. Some of those were the kinds of long-range nukes that could wipe out cities. Some members of Ukraine's parliament recognized at the time that nuclear weapons gave them leverage. They didn't want to give that up. But officials eventually relented under international pressure, especially from the U.S. That's when negotiations began to denuclearize Ukraine. The U.S., the U.K., and Russia were at the heart of these talks, convincing Ukraine to return the nukes to Russia. And in 1994, those four countries signed what is now known as the Budapest Memorandum. They promised that none of those nations would use force or threats against Ukraine, and they promised to respect their sovereignty and existing borders. Promised, but did not guarantee. The Budapest Memorandum also stated that if Ukraine was ever attacked, the U.S. and the U.K. would come to their rescue. Again, not a guarantee. Fast forward 20 years. Russia invades Crimea in blatant violation of the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine immediately called a meeting of the signatories of the memorandum. They agreed to meet in Paris. Russia never showed up. Reason being, this was not Boris Yeltsin's Russia that signed the memorandum. This was Vladimir Putin's Russia. Which brings us to today. Russia has invaded Ukraine for the second time in 8 years. If Ukraine had kept those nukes, would they be in this situation? And perhaps more to the point, if you make a promise without a guarantee, was it ever really a promise at all? Let's get into that with NBC News analyst Michael McFaul. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Russia. Ambassador, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Good to be back.
Can we zero in a little bit more on this memorandum? What was in it, apart from those assurances? Were there any other big details that are worth noting?
No, I thought you did a brilliant job of summarizing it. I think that the thing you're hinting at, but let's be clear, is this was not a treaty. You called it right, a memorandum. There were no guarantees in a legalistic sense that was ratified by the three parties. But of course, at the time when they all signed it, they all believed that everybody was going to recognize Ukraine's independence. And obviously, Vladimir Putin violated the Budapest Memorandum back in 2014, and he's upped the ante, of course, in a much more horrific way, violating that memorandum with this war that he launched 3 weeks ago.
Talk a little bit more about the mentality of the parties at the time. I mean, it seems like a lot to give back your nuclear weapons on a pinky swear without any kind of guarantee that, like, okay, you're really going to do this, right? But was this the beginning of what might have been a larger process to set up some kind of like formal agreements or treaties, or did everyone kind of consider it done once the Budapest Memorandum was signed?
Well, I think there's two things to remember about that era. First, it was the end of the Soviet Union. It was the time when both Ukraine and Russia were democracies. We obviously were a democracy. And, you know, we thought all countries were going to be democracies, and democracies don't fight each other. Democracies don't invade each other. So I think that's an important thing to remember. Back in the early 90s, that was the euphoric time that we were living in. Tragically, we know what happened in Russia when they started to move away from democracy, when Vladimir Putin took over, was elected, but appointed by Yeltsin, by the way, the very guy that you just were showing that signed it on behalf of democratic Russia, was the one that appointed him prime minister and then appointed him acting president. You know, in essence, he was the one that chose Putin to be the next president. A horrific, horrific mistake. I think will go down in history as one of the most strategic errors ever, because Putin then unraveled democracy inside Russia. And that's part of the, you know, that's the essence of the battle between Russia and Ukraine today. It's about autocratic Russia trying to roll back democratic Ukraine. But the second thing you need to add that frequently gets lost is at the same time that they were signing that, there was something called the Nunn-Lugar Agreement. conventional threat reduction, whereby we gave both Russia and Ukraine and Kazakhstan, by the way, they also gave up their nuclear weapons, don't forget. And in return, we also gave them billions of dollars to try to destroy those weapons in a safe way. So that was part of the quid pro quo back in the early 1990s.
With regard to kind of where this puts us now, the question of what if they had their nukes, I really struggle with that question, because I'm not even sure that's the right framing for the question. You know what I mean? Like, if they had their nukes, it doesn't necessarily mean that they would never have threatened other nations with them. Who knows what the political trajectory of Ukraine would have been like under that circumstance? I mean, the butterfly effect is a law of science for a reason. So I don't even know if that's an answerable question. But how do you see it?
It's a good point. We don't know. That's a counter in political science. We call that a counterfactual, right? What if they would have kept the weapons? Would things have been different? You know, there's a big assumption in this argument too that just holding on to those weapons, they could have made them useful and operational. That's a questionable assumption as well. And remember, to retain and maintain nuclear weapons also costs a lot of money. Ukraine didn't have a lot of money in 1994 when they signed that. But let's face it, it didn't happen. We are talking about counterfactuals. I think the real implication of the violation of the Budapest Memorandum is for other countries either that have nuclear weapons that we want to have them give them up, thinking of North Korea, or countries that we want to deter from acquiring them and obtaining usable nuclear weapons like Iran. When you look at what happened with Putin invading, and you have the potential either to keep the nuclear weapons you have or to develop them, you're going to think twice before you sign any treaty. And most certainly, you're going to think twice before you sign something called a memorandum.
I wonder if I could track back to something that the former Russian foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, said in our last segment. He was foreign minister in like much of Boris Yeltsin's time. Yeah. And we asked him, like, what do you think about? Yeah, we asked him, like, what do you think about the prospect of whether Vladimir Putin was just saber rattling when he said, we've got nukes, don't bug us. And he said he's not suicidal. I tend to get that because if Vladimir Putin's aim is actually to kind of see the reunited glory of the Soviet Union, I think he wants to survive long enough to see his statue go up in Red Square, right? I don't think he would do this as a suicide mission. But what do you think? I hear where the former foreign minister is coming from, but how do you see it?
Well, I was alarmed when he said he was putting his forces on a higher alert. And even if the probability of a nuclear war, let's say it went up from 0.5% to 0.6%, I want the U.S. government and all leaders of the world, because a nuclear war affects the entire planet, let's be clear about that, not just the United States and Russia, to do whatever they can to push that probability down, right? So I want General Milley, for instance, to be calling his counterpart, General Gerasimov, to say, could you please clarify, are you changing your doctrine here? They just in January, just so you know, signed a document saying we all understand that wars, nuclear wars, are unwinnable and should never be approached. I want Xi Jinping to make that phone call too. He's the one guy that Putin listens to. But I also agree with the foreign minister. By the way, I wrote the preface to his memoir, so I've watched and known him for a long time. I think we met first in 1990. He was a fantastic foreign minister for Russia. I also think what he says is correct. He's unnerved, he's daring, he does things for ideological purposes, not just a kind of rational actor, but he's not suicidal. I helped to negotiate the last nuclear arms control agreement that we have with Russia. It's called the New START Treaty. And we brought the number of nuclear weapons down by 30%. It was a great achievement. But this cap in that treaty is still 1,550 nuclear weapons on each side. That means we still have in place mutual assured destruction. And that means that if he launches against us, that means there's a nuclear war where everybody dies. I don't think Putin is suicidal, and I don't predict that will happen.
Ambassador Michael McFaul, always good talking to you, sir. Thanks very much.
All right. Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.